Well, hello, my friends, and welcome to Sleuth Studies, the Hardy Boys podcast. This is your host, Kira Drogue, signing on for another episode of exploration, adventure, fun, and, dare I say it, mystery. In today's episode, we'll chat with special guest Dr. Reginald Wiebe and take a deep dive into Canadiana, what it means for a work to be Canadian, why it matters if a work is or isn't Canadian, and what ties the Hardy Boys to Canadiana. Friends, it is an absolute honor to be joined today by Dr. Reginald Wiebe, Chair of Literature and Language at Concordia University of Edmonton. Dr. Wiebe specializes in Canadian, postcolonial, and graphic literature. His interests include exploring the intersections between history and fiction in Canadian literature and canon formation in Canadian literature. On the side of graphic literature studies, his book, The Cancer Plot, Terminal Immortality in Marvel's Moral Universe, co-written with Dr. Dorothy Woodman, explores the use of cancer in the construction of moral narratives in Marvel's comics. Welcome. It is so wonderful to have you. I'm so excited about this conversation. And I'm so grateful to you for taking the time.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'm excited to have this conversation too.
It's getting to talk about the Hardy Boys is amazing. Getting to talk about academia is amazing. And getting to mix the two is like one of my favorite spaces to live in.
Oh, me too. I love it. Pop culture, generally sort of lowbrow. I also research in comics, so I do have a great affinity for the texts that have been often rejected by highbrow academia and that are starting to, I think, build up more space in those spaces, as well as, proliferating in online spaces, podcasts, stuff like that.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, I'm so excited. I've got the biggest grin on my face and no one can see it except you.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to start just by kind of setting the scene. So in all of the reading I did, about you before I invited you to, be a part of this, I noticed something very similar is, when you're listed as being more than a professor of English literature. It's Canadian literature. And I mean, we're going to get into what it means for something to be Canadian literature shortly. But I'm curious what it means for you to study Canadian literature and kind of how you feel like you ended up in that sphere.
How any prof ends up in the sphere they teach is a weird, unique story, I think.
Absolutely.
But not necessarily really interesting. I ended up in academia because I loved studying English, and I found myself drawn particularly to Westerns in my master's, and even more specifically the difference between sort of the Canadian Western and the American Western, and the idea of, in the American Western, the manifest destiny, the cowboy who moves west as the border inexorably moves with him. Mm-hmm. And the Canadian Western exists, but not in the same way. We often have narratives about Mounties rather than cowboys, so official agents of law,
right.
Government, peace, order, and good government, as opposed to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And these distinctions sort of first captured my eye, and that's how I ended up in CanLit. I also find myself more drawn to contemporary literature, and so a lot of my friends in grad school and people who do really great work were working in older eras. And contemporary British literature felt too culturally distinct, something I didn't feel I had a grounding in.
Right.
And I didn't, as much as I love reading books by contemporary American authors, again, didn't feel I had that sort of cultural context to explore it well. And so I kind of ended up in CanLit, partly because I like Westerns.
That is, I could take this conversation totally separately because now I just want to talk about Westerns.
Yeah.
That is so fascinating.
A genre often that the Hardy Boys will dabble in, or they're at least adjacent to quite frequently.
Absolutely, particularly some of the originals. And there were slight deviations in between, what was published originally and then what existed after the edits. But lots of those Western storylines very much stayed through.
Yeah, and the lineage of the sort of the boys' adventure story coming out of the pulps and the dime novels. The Hardy Boys are a descendant of that same sort of branch of the literary family tree.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's so fascinating. Okay. So we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about what it means for a work to be Canadian. And I think it's important that we kind of, set the scene for what that means. And because I have a communications background, and I spent a lot of time working in, reading in, writing in Canadian communication theory. So when I think about how we define something as Canadian in that sphere, I think back to the CRTC, or the Canadian Radio, Television, and Telecommunications Commission. I wanted to make sure I got it right. And they're like point-based criteria of what makes a TV program or a film Canadian, and, which of the key functions are performed by Canadians and what that looks like. How does that work in a literary sphere? How do we define something as Canadian in a literature sphere?
The national literary definitions are quite capacious. And so when we think about British literature and American literature and Canadian literature, we often think sort of specifically about writers from a place or who spent significant creative time in that place writing about it. So you can have a writer like John Irving, who American-born, lives in Canada. You'll often see a maple leaf beside his name when a book comes out.
Right.
And so would we consider, like the Cider House Rules, CanLit is a debatable question. But the sort of the core definition would be writers who, even pre-Confederation, and this is where Canada and Commonwealth literature sort of overlap, the Venn diagram between the two, it would be writers from or who spent significant creative time in a place or texts about that place.
Interesting. And
it's not quite the maple, right, from like the radio music artist performance lyrics.
Yeah.
But it is analogous to it, I think. If you can, for a song to be CanCon, right, it has to have two of those four criteria.
Right.
And so if we think about a writer, are they a writer like Rohinton Mistry, who's not writing about Canada, but we consider him a Canadian author, or Ondaatje, right, who wasn't born in Canada, but moved to Canada and doesn't write exclusively about Canada. We often can almost exclusively consider him, in the field at least, a Canadian writer. Mm-hmm. And so those definitions do blur. They're not straightforward. Simply having been born in Canada isn't always sufficient, but usually would count. And then a writer who moves to Canada, we would usually claim them as well.
Claim them. I love it. Hi, congratulations, you're Canadian now.
And part of the history of this is the history of trying to define CanLit. CanLit has been preoccupied about what is CanLit for its sort of entire academic or disciplinary existence. And so a lot of times it's claiming a sort of legitimacy as a national literature, as opposed to, or triangulated between American and British literatures as well. So the question of what is CanLit is the question that CanLit is constantly asking itself.
And that's something I've always found really interesting, because at one point in my life, I was like, I'm going to start a Canadian literary agency. And then I was like, what does that mean? And I got so wrapped up in trying to figure out how I would define Canadian literature that I was like, I can't do this.
Yeah.
Because there's so many different ways to look at it. And that brings us back to the Hardy Boys, because not very many people know that, Franklin W. Dixon does not exist. Yeah. Even the original author, Leslie McFarlane, who that was wrong. Leslie McFarlane, who is Canadian, didn't know what the W in Franklin W. Dixon stood for. But he always joked in all of his writing that it did not stand for wealthy.
Yeah.
We know what it didn't stand for. So I don't know how much you know about kind of the background of the Hardy Boys. So the Hardy Boys were the brainchild of Edward Stratemeyer of the Stratemeyer Syndicate, and they kind of had a monopoly on children's literature in the 1920s, 1930s. They were, bringing out stories like the Rover Boys, and I'm thinking about the Dana Girls, but that was after the Hardy Boys. Tom Swift. They everything that kids were reading was predominantly coming out of the Stratemeyer Syndicate. Edward Stratemeyer obviously did not have time to write all of those books himself, though that would have been probably very interesting. So what he would do is he would come up with the concepts, he would write outlines for what the books would look like, and then he would farm them out to writers typically across the States, but now moving into Canada as well. So Leslie McFarlane started with, Dave Fearless. I was thinking about Dave Fearless.
Okay. Yeah.
Because in his autobiography, he talks about how annoyed he became with Day Fearless. And he's like, I am done with this. Like, $100 a book is glorious, but not for this. I can't do it anymore. And that was when Stratemeyer reached out and was like, okay, here is this series that I have this idea for. Here are some outlines for characters and, the plot of the first book. Bring it to life. See what you can do with it. And Stratemeyer always, I think, really appreciated what Les brought to the Hardy Boys. But circling back, so Franklin W. Dixon, name on the title, does not exist. Original author, Leslie McFarlane, Canadian. Original ideator, I guess, Edward Stratemeyer, not Canadian. How would you classify the Hardy Boys in that case? Do we consider those first 30 some odd books, would they be considered Canadian simply by authorship?
Well, I'm interested in that question because partly it's a question of definition. It's establishing the parameters by which you would define Can Lit in order to say these books are or are not Canadian. Mm-hmm. And so I think on a disciplinary level, if you were to ask someone to shelve these in a section of a library, for instance, they probably wouldn't put them in the Canadian authorship section for the main reason that settings and originator of the idea wouldn't be Canadian. But I'm also interested in the capacious definition of Can Lit, and so what would a definition of Can Lit be that included McFarlane and included the Hardy Boys books? So that definition, how would we establish it? Because there are a lot of texts that we want to claim, actors, musicians that we like to, as sort of thinkers in the field of Can Lit, like asking ourselves, what does Can Lit mean if it includes these people? Yeah. And so for a definition of Can Lit to include McFarlane, it's then a writer-based definition. The writer's origin, so the text is Canadian because the writer is Canadian. And there's not, there is a history for this. If we think about Ghostbusters. Yes. Ghostbusters, co-written by Dan Aykroyd and Ivan Reitman. Yeah. Co-starring Dan Aykroyd. So we have a Canadian writer, a star, and a Canadian co-writer and director. So is Ghostbusters Can Lit or CanCon? Takes place famously in New York City. Yeah. The character Dan Aykroyd plays is American, but definitionally by the point system, that would be CanCon. Right. And so if we have a points-based system, then I think there would probably be a pretty high score for the Hardy Boy books, at least the ones McFarlane wrote. But then, do we distinguish Hardy Boys as a series from the Hardy Boys books that McFarlane wrote? And do we delineate those from the later edits in the 50s? And that's true, because, if that's the case, looking at any library bookshelf I've ever seen, it would kind of be a moot point because they only have the ones that existed, post-edits. But then the other way to think about Can Lit is Northrop Frye's and Margaret Atwood's sort of thematic definitions. Mm-hmm. So Northrop Frye talks about the garrison mentality. So when I mentioned Westerns earlier, the American foundational myth of the West is the frontier, something that a person can approach and retreat from. Whereas Frye, describing Can Lit, like early pre-Confederation Can Lit and then early Can Lit, describes it as a garrison, so a fort surrounded by the frontier. The frontier is not something one can approach and retreat from safely. It is a place that is constantly surrounding and feels threatening to the settlers. Oh, interesting. And so the garrison mentality for Frye is sort of the definitional theme of Can Lit. Margaret Atwood would later work with this in a book called Survival, where she would suggest that the defining theme of Can Lit is survival. So there's either bare survival or mean survival, the idea of just living, mm-hmm. and then the idea of surviving on a more abstract level, right? Not just eking out enough food to live, but then what does it mean to live? What does it mean to live as a Canadian or live in this place? And so those are two definitions we could use to think about the Hardy Boys as Can Lit. So we would then probably want to use a more thematic definition. And I think for the Hardy Boys, I think Atwood's definition of survival kind of becomes key, because one of the key components of early Hardy Boys books is not just the mystery or the adventure, it's also the threat. They're constantly exploring a threatening environment. Sometimes they're, decrepit mansions or lighthouses, mysterious caves, but there's that sense that what these books are about isn't just the adventure, it's about the act of surviving in a hostile environment, and that Atwood would have argued, at least she did in Survival, is sort of a fundamentally Canadian theme.
Totally. And that's interesting, because I have had some conversations with friends and colleagues about the difference between Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys, because I'm not your, stereotypical Hardy Boys reader. I'm not the intended audience for these books. And it took me, I think, until I started this podcast to realize that there's a level of peril in the Hardy Boys that just isn't also present in Nancy Drew. And I think it was that peril that kind of drew me in. I wanted that extra bit of danger. But thematically, that's really interesting, because I'd always kind of leaned back on, because I've always claimed those original Hardy Boys books as CanCon. That is my claim to Canadian fame. Yeah. I'm like, do you know who wrote these? He was Canadian.
Yeah.
But I also like to think that, thinking about some of the themes that are present in those early books, and again, early books that not a lot of people have the context for anymore, because they're not the ones that are on bookshelves and haven't been for 75 years. I'm thinking about things that show up a lot in literature that, we have collectively deemed Canadian, and themes of, family and food and celebration. And in those early books, the Hardy Boys do not go anywhere without a carefully packed lunch. They are going out to the beach to have a massive picnic and a big ol' food-induced coma nap afterwards. It is a big deal for them to have that, that collective experience with the people around them. At the end of every mystery, it's, how are we celebrating? We're celebrating with a big old meal. We have solved the case, and we are just going to eat all of the food in existence with all of our friends and family and celebrate the fact that, we're still around, we did it, and we probably only have 3 concussions each. It's totally fine. But also, there's a very distinct focus in the early books on place. And place is a really curious question in the Hardy Boys, because Bayport, U.S.A. doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So there's this place that, through history, different Hardy Boy scholars have been like, oh, well, it could refer to this and it could refer to that. And the general consensus is that it's based on Haileybury, Ontario, which is where McFarlane grew up. So there's lots of places in the Hardy Boys series that are very similar to places where McFarlane lived and, grew up. And that brings up a really curious question, because, here is this fictional place that in theory is in the United States, because again, Stratemeyer, American, lots of readers, America.
Yeah.
It's the place to be, apparently. But there's a lot of different things that point towards, Bayport, USA actually being somewhere in Canada.
There are two, I think, really interesting corollaries to this discussion. One is Metropolis. So Superman sort of famously, perhaps, or maybe less famously, co-created by a Canadian, and Metropolis and the Daily Star, the original newspaper that would later become the Daily Planet, are based on Toronto visually and also sort of vibes-wise, if we can say that's a distinct academic category, vibes.
100%. Vibes, yeah, that is an academic term here.
But a lot of comic scholars and fans and historians will often suggest Metropolis is kind of Toronto and Gotham City is kind of New York. And so we have these histories of, particularly throughout our film industry, of Vancouver and Toronto, but every Canadian center to some degree cosplaying as an American city.
Oh,
right?
Always.
Rumble in the Bronx, Jackie Chan is in New York, but it's, Rumble in the Bronx, but we see the Rockies in the background, right? He's on the ocean. And the other ocean, the Pacific Ocean, right?
Yeah.
And then we constantly have Toronto playing New York City. And so this is one corollary, I think, that the Canadian city is often dressed up as the American city because of the larger economic centers of art and commerce.
Oh, all the time.
That drive these texts and sort of not only inspire their creation, but are the means by which they're circulated. But the other part, the more like nerdy academic part, is Frye's, Northrop Frye's organizing question that Canlit is preoccupied with the question of place. But he says, where is here is the question. And so there's an ambiguity built in Frye's mind about what constitutes place in Canada. And Canadian writers are particularly preoccupied with the nature of their relationship to place. And so having this instability, the sort of ontological instability, it's both Ontario and the U.S. It's like it's the Atlantic coast, but it could be at various points along it. This uncertainty does reflect a pretty fundamentally, at least in Frye's mind, articulation of the interests of Canadian writers. What is this place? Where is it? And I would be remiss if I didn't say that I'm speaking here about English Canadian lit, not Francophone, as we've spoken a little bit about the Hardy Boys in French-speaking cultures are a different thing.
Apparently didn't really catch on.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. So as soon as you started talking about Vancouver, I lived in Vancouver when I did my master's, and the amount of TV shows that has now ruined for me, because you're in the moment, you're enjoying, and then you're like, hang on, I went to that coffee shop. Or because they do a lot of filming up at Simon Fraser University up on the hill. Yeah. So I'm like, oh, that's where I convocated. Why are you shooting people where I convocated? Like, students must be walking around and being like, why are they filming this random fight scene at like 3 a.m.?
Well, I think too about shows I grew up watching, like The X-Files, which spent its first, I think, 5 seasons shooting in BC.
Yeah.
And then how the show feels different when they move to California for the later seasons. There's something about for at least for me, the effect of the show, the intangibles of vibes, I guess, but also the way that BC functions in terms of older growth forests, different types of sort of old growth forest. Just the X-Files felt different after it moved to the States. Interesting.
And it's funny too, because they did a lot of filming of Supernatural in Vancouver, and same thing. I'm like, okay, there were points at which I could tell. I'm like, this is Vancouver masquerading as somewhere else.
Well,
but when they moved locations, I would be like, this doesn't feel right anymore.
If we're going to talk about Metropolis and Toronto, we should also talk about all the CW superhero shows. Vancouver is Star City, is Central City. It's
everything.
It's Mars, it's the moon.
Yeah, there's very little that Vancouver isn't, which is so fascinating. But like I said, every once in a while now I watch TV shows and I'm like, I remember watching Dirk Gently, and I was like, oh, that's the street behind where I used to live.
Yeah.
And then, every time they're walking it, I'm like, okay, I know that coffee shop. I recognize this. And then suddenly I'm no longer paying attention to the plot of the film, because I'm just like, oh, look at what's over here. It's so interesting. And I mean, tying again, I guess, back to film and the Hardy Boys, there was a Hardy Boys TV series that was released starting in 2020. And it was it fits all of the definitions of Canadian to a T. And it was filmed in Ontario. And I always thought that was really interesting, because my fundamental, I would classify the early Hardy Boys books as Canadian. And then seeing of the, I guess, 4 quote unquote popular Hardy Boys TV series over the last 100 years, 2 of them have been, I'm going to go ahead and say, aggressively Canadian.
Well, it's interesting, too, if they shoot in the locations where the stories sort of were originally set, and we could use quotation marks around set.
Yeah.
But then there's this fascinating recurrence where they end up accidentally recreating the settings as originally designed.
Yeah, I'm hoping to talk to some folks that were involved in that production on this podcast, because either somebody got insanely lucky, or someone out there has done so much research into the Hardy Boys that I just want to sit them down and pick their brain. Because the more I watch that series, the more callbacks I see to the original books. And I'm always like, I wonder. But it is just so much fun. And it's fun as a reflection of, because there are folks that are very much traditionalists, and like this is, and you probably see this very often in the translation from comic to film, you know, from book to film. I'm like, oh, they've made some changes to the characters, and they've, you know, changed settings, and they've made all of these, you know, slight but significant differences. And lots of people will turn their nose up at that and be like, those aren't my Hardy Boys. I don't recognize that because it isn't exactly as it was written. Where, like, in the 70s, they very much tried to follow that very, you know, this is almost to a T exactly how it was written. But this TV show that was done in 2020 that was set in the 80s, very different.
It's set in the 80s?
It's set in the 80s.
Oh, okay. I really do need to watch that.
It's fun. So yeah, highly recommend this TV series. Both for funsies, and also it's a fun little academic study depending on how intently you want to go into it. Okay, so we've had this really fascinating conversation about the, you know, the struggle that we've had through all these years trying to, you know, figure out what is Canadian, what isn't Canadian, what we want to be Canadian. And I feel like there are people out there that are like, okay, high-level conversations about this, glorious, super fun. Why does it matter? And I think there are lots of different answers to that question. Like, there's, you know, why it matters on an academic level, why it matters on a, you know, technical, are you eligible for this Canadian Literary Award level. You know, if you were having this conversation with someone and they were like, okay, but what does it matter if a work is Canadian or not? I assume you have some feelings on that.
I do have some feelings. So one of the things that's interesting about the Hardy Boys and the revisions, the edits in the 50s is that coincides with the Massey Commission's report. So the Massey Commission, post-World War II, was tasked with assessing the anemic state of Canadian cultural production. And so a lot of the CRTC, the CanCon requirements come out of that. And so these are questions of practicality, what can get made.
Right.
And so to some degree, the Canadian government funds art.
There's always, I work in funding. Yeah. So there's always an importance of, you know, how do you qualify this and does it qualify for funding? Because, and like, I understand the logic there. Sorry, I'm going off on a little side thing there.
It's, I think, a relevant tangent.
Well, because funding is, particularly grant funding, which is where I spend lots of my time. There are lots of specific definitions of, in order to receive this funding, you have to be a not-for-profit, you have to be a registered charity, you have to have, I don't know, 50% of your board live within a specific geographic area. And I know that, you know, in some cases that just all comes together gloriously and, you know, organizations are eligible for funding. But there are certain organizations that are building themselves to fit within specific funding guidelines. And I think that plays a significant part in what the CRTC, like what all of these regulations are building, is they're trying to make sure that there's a lot of Canadian involvement in these productions. Yeah,
Margaret Atwood has a poem called Backdrop Addresses Cowboy, and one of the lines in it is, I'm the space you desecrate as you pass through. I paraphrase, I might not be quoting it exactly, but it's speaking about American cultural production and the sort of the American imperial cultural production that isn't even necessarily part of the sort of more recent aggressive strain of American cultural imperialism or like literal imperialism.
Yep.
It's part of a sense of benign takeover that American media and media properties have been so pervasive in the Canadian media ecosystems that to resist requires some consistent and concerted efforts.
Yeah.
And so CanCon then becomes a bit of a buttress to preserve a sense of Canadian identity, and that requires a certain level of government funding against the asymmetric warfare of the American media industrial complex.
Right.
And so then what is CanCon does count on the sort of the bare terms of does this qualify for a Canada Council Arts grant or something, but also in sort of the more nebulous terms of cultural sovereignty and identity. And so those are very nebulous terms as well. We have Francophone identities, we have a range of Anglophone identities, we have multiple Indigenous nations as well. So it's not a simple, straightforward answer.
Yeah.
But CanCon then functions as not only a sort of a national unifier, but as a buttress against the cultural imperialism of our neighbor to the south.
Totally. And I love the classification of that as like it's more than just about being Canadian. It's about not being, American or British. And that's really fascinating to me.
A lot of pre-Confederation Canlit is in fact defined by this triangulation. We're not British, we're not American, what are we? And so for some, it's a Goldilocks zone. The porridge isn't too hot or too cold, it's perfect.
Yeah.
And then as Canada becomes a country, as Canada starts facing all the problems that countries do, as the Confederation expands to include more provinces and territories, these become much more complicated questions. Canadian identity for Susanna Moodie and Catherine Park-Trail, pre-Confederation writers, was pretty much located to Ontario.
Oh,
and so
interesting.
even our sense of what Canada is has expanded throughout the development of Canlit. But I think the question of why does it matter if we call the Hardy Boys Canadian or not is partly a statement of cultural sovereignty, of sort of the fact that Canlit exists and is worth studying.
I don't even know what to say. I just want to grin over that. I love it so much.
I love getting to talk about Canlit too. Outside of the classroom, my students are really engaged with this, but one of the things that is different about a conversation like this is the need to be succinct and declarative, whereas in a classroom, the lectures and conversational style are different.
Yeah, and it's a lot because, the amount of time I spent, again, I'm going to call back to Canadian communication theory and looking at, someone like John Grierson, who wasn't born in Canada, but spent a significant portion of his career in Canada and, is relatively well known as like the father of documentary film and Canadian documentary film. And I'm going to say it again, worked with Leslie McFarlane. That is the coolest thing. I'm going to do some more research on that, find some more information, but that just blew my mind. But I feel like that's why the concept of like, what is Canadian and how do we define it and why does it matter? Like those questions just kind of follow in, I think, any form of academia that...
Oh, yeah, we love to classify things.
Oh,
yeah.
And finding something that is so incredibly difficult to classify is a lot of fun, too.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I enjoy having the conversation about the Hardy Boys, is because there's so many different facets to it. And it really depends on, what the parameters are in your definition, because you can define CanCon and Canadiana in, a million different ways, depending on what works for you.
Yeah, sorry to talk over you, Kira.
By all means.
One of the things I think is particularly interesting about the Hardy Boys as a site for this conversation is when we think about Hardy Boys, many people probably think about it almost as paradigmatic Americana, right? The rise of the teenager, even though it predates that, right? The sense of mass market paperbacks or mass market hardcovers, distribution of literature. We think about the setting and the themes as almost stereotypically or paradigmatic American texts.
Yeah.
And so to subvert that, to speak to the ways in which it breaks down those definitions is also part of the value of the conversation. To distinguish between the sort of homogeneity of American lit as a monolith and being able to break that down and even break down the cultural barriers or the disciplinary boundaries of American lit is also, I think, the other half of what makes it interesting. It's not that we take it back from American lit, but we question the sovereignty of American lit as a field.
I love it. I love it. It makes it. It kind of ties me back to, so Leslie McFarlane wrote The Hardy Boys, and he brought all of these characters to life, and they weren't necessarily his overarching ideas, but he took what he was given from Edward Stratemeyer and he built on that. And whether or not it was intentional, and at this point, outside of what's left in the writing that he's done in his journals and, the people that are still around that, knew him, we'll never really know if he, intentionally was like, Bayport.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, sorry. That's very Canadian, my friends. Or, you know, if he's... I remember very distinctly the first time I read a Hardy Boys book where they had... Because they travel to Canada often enough in their adventures. And I remember one case in which I think they had to like change planes in Edmonton or something. And I was like, they're here. This is so exciting. And I don't know if that's a thing in the U.S. where you're like, oh, I've been there. I recognize this place. But every time they came to Canada, I was like, yes, Canadian adventure.
I think that's part of being a Canadian reader, is recognizing sites within larger media or intellectual property narratives. And maybe that's a contemporary thing, but I do feel as if it's the small fish syndrome, sort of the recognizing yourself in a context where you or your context are rarely mentioned.
People don't really write about Edmonton.
Yeah.
Like, Edmonton does not appear in, your big old blockbusters.
Oh, there's an issue of Avengers a few years ago when they end up in Regina, and I'm originally from Saskatchewan myself, so I'm like, the Avengers are in Regina? This is amazing.
When were the Avengers in Regina?
Oh, there was the Jonathan Hickman run that is, I think, going to be sort of the basis for the next couple movies. There's a series of incursion events where mysterious alien... meteors are terraforming areas on the globe. And one of the ones that they target is Regina. So this would have been, so it was the Hickman run, maybe 10 plus years ago.
That is so neat. Do we, out of curiosity, you don't have to know the answer to this. Is the person who wrote that Canadian?
Hickman is not a Canadian. But if we're going to talk about famous Canadian comic book creators, John Byrne, who, though not born in Canada, is considered by many, because he was raised in Canada, Canadian comic book creator, is not the creator of Wolverine or even the co-creator, but he's probably the creator most, along with Chris Claremont, an American writer, responsible for making Wolverine popular.
That's awesome.
And he picked Wolverine because he was the only Canadian character on the X-Men.
I love that.
Wolverine is popular because he's Canadian. And Deadpool, Ryan Reynolds' character in Avatar, not a Canadian character, but has become Canadian retroactively because Reynolds himself has been so proud of his national affiliations.
I love that. And I remember this was so funny. As I was reading about the work that you've done, Superman, I was like, Superman's Canadian? And I phoned my brother and I'm like, okay, somebody needs to, because I'm like, did you know this? And he's like, yeah, didn't everybody? And I was like, okay, revoke my nerd card. Like, sorry, guys. I genuinely didn't. So out of curiosity, like we've spent so much time talking about classifying, the Hardy Boys.
Yeah.
Superman's classified that way because of one of the creators, correct?
Yeah, one of the co-creators. And so this gets to one of the issues of the Hardy Boys as well, which is, how does collaboration function in terms of authorship, particularly corporate authorship?
Totally.
And so when you have the actual physical person who does the writing or the typing and is Canadian, but the syndicate and the original editor are American, you can't say it's purely American simply because the material history sort of emphasizes the locality of those parts of the collaboration.
Right.
And so, collaboration also, and comics helps us think about this, dismantles those easy boundaries of creator and art as belonging to specific individuals.
Totally. And it's interesting too, because I think about, whatever contract or agreement that McFarlane would have had to sign, because he did, no rights to any of these books. Wasn't for a long, I don't know if he wasn't allowed to talk about them or didn't talk about them, but he was very hush-hush that he was Franklin W. Dixon.
Like an early NDA.
Right? As like, I am a literal ghostwriter.
Yeah.
I don't exist. It's fine.
Well, Siegel and Schuster famously sold the rights to Superman for just a few $100s. And so therefore, like a symbol that's now worth probably, I don't know, billions of dollars in terms of merchandising and stuff, and they didn't make much money off of it. They worked for higher contracts, but Schuster was not a particularly fast artist, and so he was sort of quickly phased out of the Superman comic.
That melts my heart.
Yeah.
Art takes time, man.
Yeah. Well, if we get into the ways that artists have been impoverished while creating things that have made corporations untold numbers of dollars, it's quite heartbreaking.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, that happened with the Hardy Boys too.
Yeah.
Like, Leslie McFarlane was making, I think it was $125 a book. And obviously we have to consider inflation here, but that's still not a lot of money. And we think about the like multi-million-dollar industry that the Hardy Boys is now, and you know, the legacy that it's brought on. And he didn't even know that they were popular for the longest time.
Yeah.
Like, I spoke with his son, and his son remembers seeing the books on his dad's bookshelf and being like, "Oh, you liked those?" And he was like, "No, I wrote them." And just that moment of like, "Excuse me, what?"
Well, this is really digressive, but Carl Barks, one of the famous comic book creators for Disney Comics, is the creator of Uncle Scrooge and the originator of much of the Donald Duck stuff that people know about. But Barks famously worked for a company that wanted to at least preserve the illusion that Walt Disney was directly involved in the creation of almost every facet of Disney multimedia. And so his name was not publicized. So fans recognized his art. Sophisticated fans can distinguish between art styles,
absolutely,
right? Even without having a name associated to it. So he was called the Good Duck Artist amongst fans, and eventually was tracked down because he wasn't getting fan letters from Disney, because Disney didn't want him to know how popular his comics were. And so, yeah, a lot of the stuff in the DuckTales TV series and in the more recent DuckTales TV series as well comes directly from one creator, but not a guy who gets sort of any direct credit, and certainly only made some money, but not commensurate to the amount of profit made off of his artistic creations.
Corporations, man.
Yeah, and thinking about McFarlane this way is really interesting too, because his works were then so highly edited.
Yeah, and there was no, like, because he'd signed the rights away. Yeah. Like, I feel like I have to defend the corporation, which I really don't. Because there's going to be many long episodes talking about those edits. But technically, you know, he didn't have any right to those. Yeah. But then it becomes a question of, like, morals and ethics, which I have lots to say on that topic and those edits. But he had no idea that those edits had even happened until someone that was a fan had come to interview him and been like, "So have you looked at these books in the last however many years?" And, you know, Les being Les was like, "No, why would I?" Yeah. And he talks about this in his autobiography, and I don't remember exactly what he says, but it was something along the lines of, you know, realizing that, you know, what time and effort he'd put into bringing these characters to life had just kind of disappeared. And, you know, it didn't exist anymore. He was particularly proud of Aunt Gertrude. Aunt Gertrude is one of my favorite characters. She is the sassiest, spiciest lady. Ugh, I adore her to pieces. And in quintessentially my favorite Hardy Boys book, What Happened at Midnight, number 10, there are, like, there's a huge section in the original book where it is literally just Aunt Gertrude on a rant. She rants at Frank for like 4 pages straight about his perceived bad driving. She like accidentally leans on the horn and then shouts at him for 2 pages about how it was his fault and he shouldn't scare her like that. It's glorious, and she just brings such energy to these books.
Right?
Yeah. But then, you know, come time for the edits, when these books, according to the syndicate, have to be shorter in order to add time for more, I'm going to editorialize and say unnecessary, action and adventure and peril. You're losing to TV's a thing now. So, you know, the books have to compete. They have to be snappier and faster and, you know, all of these wonderful things. But then you're missing out on Aunt Gertrude yelling at Frank for 4 pages. And I was like, no, bring this back, please. This was my favorite part.
Well, what's fascinating to me about particularly this period, and then comparing it to the field of comic studies, is in the 1950s we have a series of, and I know that like book banning is something that you think a lot about, and comic books were banned. Comic books depicting crime were illegal in Canada from 48 to 2018, and so we have this rise.
I'm sorry, did you just say 2018?
Oh yeah, 2018. 2018. Comics depicting crime were illegal in Canada until 2018. They were in criminal code.
It's gonna take me a second to wrap my brain around that.
Play the hold music for a little bit in the edit.
2018.
Yeah. The Trudeau government changed the criminal code in, I forget which bill, but removing comics depicting crime. It was one of those sort of zombie statutes that had existed for decades. Yeah. Only one comic store, I believe it was in Calgary, was ever prosecuted. But they were charged for selling comics depicting crime.
I'm having a moment where I'm like, what comic doesn't?
So yeah, almost Canada was actually more severe in its anti-comic laws than the States. The States, the comic companies created a comics code, a form of self-censorship, that if the code stamp was on a comic, it had been approved by the Comics Code Authority. Canada had legislation. And so we have this period in the 50s where we have sort of rise of the fear of communist infiltration, all these very sort of paranoias are coalescing in terms of censorship and book banning. And so what DC Comics does is it reboots its golden age characters, starting with the Flash. And so what's interesting to me about the Hardy Boys is rather than making new Hardy Boys books, right? Like we have Flash comics from the golden age, but we'll have a new character. We want to appeal to a different demographic. The audience that would have read that now have aged out. We want to appeal to a new audience with a different distribution system. So new character, same name. I'm quite curious as to why the syndicate wouldn't have said, let's do new Hardy Boys books, especially when they were paying work for hire rates so low. How much were they saving on the edit? Was there some sort of dedicated Hardy Boys fandom sufficient to merit re-releases, or was it functioning under the sort of the auspices of people know the Hardy Boys, but none of the books specifically, so we'll just resell them. It'll be cheaper to sell them again, but we'll market them differently. Because we own them, we can do this without having to seek permission from the writer. The parallel tracks of Hardy Boys and DC superheroes and what fans and historians call the Silver Age is quite interesting, because I think they're on interesting but divergent parallel tracks.
Yeah, that is really interesting, because they did all of those edits to the Hardy Boys in-house. Like, it was all done by Harriet Adams, who was the daughter of the late, at that point, Edward Stratemeyer. And it was, from what I recall, it was Grosset and Dunlap, the publisher, who was like, we are getting a ton of complaints about, the content of these books, and they're being pulled from libraries and bookstores. And at one point, someone said that they were as dangerous to children as alcohol and narcotics. And, these books are making us money. We need to find a way to continue that.
Okay.
And then, release them under the blue covers and, a little note on the front page that's like, in this updated edition, Mr. Dixon has included updated detective, habits or whatever. But nobody really noticed until traditionally, fathers were reading it to their sons, and they're like, oh, Frank and Joe are a little different than what I remember. But it was also very much focused on, like, they aged the boys up so that they could legally drive, because following the law, very important. We can't have, young boys out there doing crazy shit and breaking laws. They became much more law-abiding and much more respectful of the law after the edits. In the originals, they were...
Yeah.
They had no faith in the Bayport Police Department. Yeah. And honestly, for the amount of crime that happens in Bayport, surprising to me that anyone does. Like, Bayport, U.S.A. might not exist, but let me tell you, it is like crime central right there.
It's like Cabot Cove and Murder, She Wrote. That town had a wild amount of murders over the years.
Right. Again, it's all about place.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. But they have done a couple of different, Hardy Boys series. Like, there's the paperback versions in, I think they started late 70s, early 80s, that start off, they're so much fun. They're very much like rootin' tootin' AK-47 shooting, they're spies now.
Okay.
Like it was, I mean, the first, spoiler alert for anybody that hasn't read the first one. It's literally the picture on the front page. But Joe and his girlfriend get into an argument. Girlfriend storms off to the car. Car explodes and girlfriend dies. And that is how this series starts. Wow. So it is immediately like way more like, it is darker and more emotional. And I mean, they're the Hardy Boys. They don't handle their emotions well. They just like bottle it up and then punch people every once in a while. But they're very much like, it's a totally different setting. And they're like, you know, it's Cold War era. There's so much to it. And then, you know, they bring it back to, you know, here are little itty bitty Frank and Joe Hardy solving playground mysteries. And they're, you know, there's an entire series where it's like, it's told from first person, which is
I've seen
so
some of those.
interesting.
Yeah, I think I picked him up at like a yard sale or something. Yeah.
Yeah. I have a collection at this point. And, you know, looking at all of the differences through the series is really fascinating. But my favorite will always be, let's look at the original and, you know, what Leslie McFarlane brought to life. And then, you know, let's look at the books that I fell in love with as a kid.
And I think there's something to the fact that the series that endures, perhaps as the carved in stone Hardy Boys, are the blue spines.
Yeah.
And so the McFarlane books are the foundation for that. He did write the stories.
He did.
They adapted his work, but those are still his stories, his creative choices with amendments.
Yeah.
And then those are the ones that endure. And I think there's something about that, to your argument about why do we consider these, why does it matter if we think about these as CanCon? It's because none of those other series have the same cultural footprint as the McFarlane books do, even in their sort of boulderized form.
Oh, absolutely. Sorry, I'm like taking a second and just, I'm enjoying the heck out of this. Is there anything else that you wanted to share? Anything that you're like, right, I sparked this and, you know, parking lotted it because we were still talking about something else?
No, I've followed my muse in this conversation, I think quite delightfully. I haven't left anything on the table.
Excellent. Well, this has been so much fun, and I've learned so much. I'm so grateful to you for taking the time to be here and chat with me, and I think I might have to go home and watch Superman again.
I think you
just
might
for, just a
little CanCon.
We'll exchange CanCon. I'll give you the Hardy Boys series on Disney Plus. I'll go home and watch Superman, and we'll report back.
Yeah.
Friends, thank you so much for joining us here today. It's been such fun chatting with Dr. Reginald Wiebe, and I want to take a moment to thank him again for his time, energy, and expertise. Until next time, this is Kira Drogue, host of Sleuth Studies, the Hardy Boys podcast, signing off. The absolutely stunning original theme music that you've just enjoyed was composed by Jeff Lee. Sleuth Studies is grateful for the support of Volunteer Alberta and the GloCal Foundation of Canada. For more information about Sleuth Studies, the Hardy Boys podcast, including our interactive timeline and blog, please visit www.sleuthstudies.ca or find us on social media @Sleuth Studies.